Hi there. We're going to be talking about cross contour today, and we're going to start out with some exercises just to get you familiar with how cross contour works and hopefully give you the skill to do your drawing on your own once you get the basics down. So we're going to start out with one of the more simple forms, and that is a sphere. So we're thinking about adding longitude and latitude lines to this drawing as if we're drawing a globe. So we've got lines that run from the North Pole to the South Pole. And really, let's just start with as close to a perfect circle as you can get. I did a light sketch to kind of help me speed this along a little bit. So you're going to draw all these exercises along with me. And so pull out your sketchbook. And you can pause the video whenever you need to in order to catch up if I'm going too fast. So the first thing, let's kind of establish a dotted line to represent the axis line that runs through the center of the Earth. And the other thing I want to do is we're going to be viewing this globe as if we're slightly looking down on the North Pole of it. It's not a complete top view of it, but it's also not a side view. So we're going to be shifting the North Pole down a little bit. So I'd like you to draw a little X or something to mark where you want to aim for, a quarter inch or so down from the top of your circle. And then the same thing on the back side. We have to kind of imagine, even though this is hidden out of our view, we have to imagine that the South Pole is the same distance from the bottom edge of the circle that the North Pole is from the top. So plot those out lightly. And then we're thinking about the lines that run from the North to South Pole. So what happens here, because we're seeing it slightly from the top, this gets a little bit tricky, but what I want you to do is try to imagine a couple ellipses that are going to be merging with the outer contour of this circle, not right at the center, but slightly off. So if we could see through this globe, we would be able to see the back side of this line coming up on the back side of it's a little lopsided, so sorry about that. And then we'll do one coming the other way as well. And again, do your best to we're just kind of slanting that ellipse a little bit. We're still trying to aim for that South Pole on the back side if possible. So try to kind of imagine those ellipses with, those center lines are actually confusing things, so I'm going to get rid of them again. Not give you too much information right now. All right, so we've got an approximate, right now we've got a couple lines that scribe from the North Pole down, disappear out of sight, and tuck back up toward the South Pole on the back side. Those are the harder ones to do. Now we're going to add in the equator line. So what I want you to do is estimate where the center of your whole circle is and draw a little dotted line for yourself. This is going to be the center of the ellipse that represents the equator running around there, around the ball. And because we've turned it a fair amount since the North Pole is shifted down into the ball a little bit, let's go ahead and make this ellipse fairly rounded, not a straight line. So again, draw the whole thing, even though we're only going to be darkening in the front part of it for now. Okay, and then we're going to want to have a few more lines just to kind of really make the ball feel more round. So try to keep your other ellipses about the same proportions, even though they're getting a little bit narrower as we get toward the North Pole. But keep this first one in mind as you're drawing the other ones that All right, so again, darken the front side a little bit more so we can start to see it. You can lighten the hidden sides or make them dotted lines to kind of keep things clear in your own mind about where those planes are located. Okay, so we have a really basic shape here, but it's starting to feel a little more three-dimensional. If you wanted to have one more ellipse up here, again, try to keep it about the same proportions as the other ones that are drawn on that same sphere. And that's pretty good. We could add more lines in between if we wanted to. We could add a line that goes straight down the middle. It doesn't show much depth because it's right on our line of sight, but you can add one there. You can also add one that would sort of cut the globe in half from front to back. So we start off right here, but then it needs to merge with that side contour as we get, so try to keep it nice and smooth if you can. And you could add more lines in between. So it's sort of like we've cut the earth in half from right to left, from front to back, and then we've quartered it, you know, diagonally too. So we've got like 8 chunks there if we cut that apart. Now this is a simpler form than even an apple is. The apple is more complex because instead of these lines just going straight across the North Pole, we've got to sink the North Pole down into the earth a little bit to create that hollow shape like a funnel that the apple needs to fit into. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you lighten the lines that we've drawn here a little bit, and I'm going to just draw on top with a piece of tracing paper so you can kind of see how you would modify the drawing to create a sunken end to that sphere. So in your drawing you might want to take photographs of it at different stages if you're changing it quite a bit for me. I'm going to ask you to submit all these sketches. So I'm going to go ahead and just maybe tack this down so it's not shifting around too much, and I'm going to show you how to make some modifications now as we go. So instead of going straight across here, what we're going to do is we're going to shift the point where the stem of the apple attaches. So we're going to kind of draw an apple from this point of view, and we're thinking about where the stem actually attaches is kind of out of our viewpoint from this angle. So I'm going to add, instead of just going straight across like this, we're going to add a little bit of a contour here to kind of suggest how that apple is starting to go down into that crevice. But these lines now, instead of just meeting right here, they're going to get modified a little bit. So what we're going to do is it's kind of like we're on a roller coaster, and that line's going to go up over the crest and then aim down toward this point. So it's a lot like when we were drawing the leaves for the slow contour drawing. You're thinking about finding that center line and having it aim down. Even though that part isn't a visible part of our drawing, it's important to think about that so that the way the line disappears out of sight is convincing. So it sort of just like falls down over that hill and disappears out of sight. And then these lines that are coming around the back, also instead of meeting there where the original North Pole was, they need to also sink down to this new destination. So these lines that come up around the back also head down into that hole. And we can kind of redraw this edge of the apple. And again, you can add more lines just to make it more clear. The lines are going to get straighter and straighter as we approach the center line, and then they become closer to horizontals as they move out around the apple. So now it is a more convincing sense that that's dipping down in there. The other thing that's going to help that really feel more three-dimensional is if we add a few more ellipses here. So what happens is these ellipses on the inside are actually going down like a vortex into this point. So you might have a couple ellipses that sort of disappear out of sight, and then they'll get more spread out as they move away from that funnel shape. So that's what we'll look for on your apples. You can even add a stem. If your apple has a stem, you're going to be drawing from life, so you're going to be making that. And even the stem itself might have some cross contours on it that give it a little bit of roundness. Okay, so that's one way you could create a sunken part of your apple. Let's say now that you've taken a bite out of your apple, like this one has, and now instead of the form bulging outward, we've got a hollowed out section of that apple. So what happens is whichever direction those contour lines had been traveling as they pass around the apple, now they're suddenly reversing direction, and it becomes a hollowed out shape. So we're going to be changing the direction of these downward curving lines and making them arch upward. So the way we need to do that is first indicate where we want that bite to happen on the apple, and then we'll change our lines to show that that's actually a hollowed out part of the apple instead of a bulge. So let's go ahead and just kind of create kind of this ragged, you can make a ragged hole, or you can make a really precise hole like the Death Star or something if you want a real smooth piece there. And then any lines that fall within that area we really should erase so they're not confusing us. So if you have any lines that fall within that bite mark, you should take them out. And then what happens is we're going to kind of correct these curves. So I have this downward line. When it hits that bite mark, instead of curving downwards like a smile, it needs to reverse and become kind of like a frown shape. So again, depending on how deep that bite is, that amount of curve might vary. You could even do, make it jagged like teeth marks if you want to make it a little more realistic looking. So I'm adding a few more lines because one or two wouldn't be enough to really describe the complexities of that surface. And then, so we've got some latitude lines in there. We're going to also add some longitude lines that cross across that bite mark so that we also know that it's hollow when we're following those vertical lines. So we can kind of take some of these lines, add some new ones if we need to fit across that bite, and then again it might scallop in the opposite direction. So if the line had been curving to the right, like a backward C, when you get to that bite mark, it has to curve the opposite direction. And I'm going to add a few more in there to really make it clear. And then these lines continue. So again, you can add as many lines as you need to really describe those areas. But now that feels like it's a hollowed out area, even without shading, we've been able to do that. All right, so now let's try another modification. Let's pretend that instead of an apple, we're going to turn this into a pear. So again, you can start with a different circle if you'd like to, or you can take a photograph of your sketch at this point and then make erasings, or you could even get some tracing paper and trace over if you want to. But we're going to see what happens if we try a pear shape now. So we're still kind of got this basic form, and let's say the pear is laying on its side, which makes things a little bit more complicated for some students to think out. But often if you're trying to draw it from that angle, the central line is no longer straight up and down, so it might be leaning on an angle. And let's say that we've got the end of the pear. I've got a slide here, I think, of a pear. Let me go to that. Okay, so let me see if I've got a version of it where it's kind of aiming towards us, maybe not. Okay. Well, let's try to get it in the same orientation as my sketch. So let's say we're looking at the bottom end of the pear, and we're going to try to add that point onto it. So when you're drawing the pear, what I would do is first figure out, measure the fattest part of the pear, the belly of the pear, and then in a foreshortened view like this, you might not see much of the point of the pear. So use your measuring skills and figure out exactly how big that additional kind of triangular shape needs to be to stay in proportion to the pear. And again, I'm just going to kind of estimate since I don't want to measure right now. But let's just kind of pencil in. And again, I'm thinking of the center line to try to keep it fairly symmetrical. You might also think about where that neck of the pear would actually attach if you were trying to keep your proportions pretty accurate. And then here we've got, instead of a really extreme indentation like we would have on an apple, it's a more subtle change here. So instead of just going straight across, it's going to dip in a little bit, but not nearly as abruptly as it happened on the apple. So let's just kind of retrace some of these lines and just show how that might change a little bit if you were doing a pear shape instead of an apple. So these lines that cut across, it's a subtle reversal of direction, just like an S curve maybe. These that come in might do something like that. So, and then if you had some other lines that you wanted to bring around the back side of the pear, that might happen there. And then you might add a few ellipses, keeping in mind the proportions of your other ellipses that you've drawn already in the pear. They'll get fatter and fatter until they start disappearing around the edges of the pear. And then at this end, if the pear had a stem, maybe it does, that's moving away from us, those ellipses would, curve that way. And these lines, what happens is they start to dip in. So whatever happens at the outer contours, those are your most extreme curves. And then as you get toward the center line, the lines get straighter and straighter. So if you're following this line, it's going to dip in a little bit, but it's not I'm not doing a real abrupt angle change like this. I'm doing a gradual curve because that's what's happening on the surface of the pear. It's not a really sharp indentation. So try to be as sensitive as you can to the actual surface of the object that you're drawing. And then we're going to add a few more of the latitude cross contour lines to this end of the pear as well. But always think about what's happening if you could see the other part of that ellipse wrapping around the back side of the pear so that the way it connects at the edges here is really believable. The tendency for a lot of students is to be in a rush and not really try to think about that line as merging with your outer contour, and instead they end up doing something like this. So they'll have an apple and they just kind of hit the edge at a pretty blunt angle, and it doesn't really feel like the lines are going to wrap around, or some are super curved and others are super straight, and they're not really thinking about trying to keep each of the ellipses a similar ratio. So when you're going to adjust the line weight, I would darken the outer contours of your fruit or whatever object you end up drawing, and then do your best to transition the line weight. So start the lines dark toward the outer contour and make them lighter as they come across. I would not worry about the line weight until the very end. You can always kind of finesse that later once you're sure your ellipses are all good, but as the form sinks into space, go a little bit darker, and as it bulges out towards you, let the lines get a little bit lighter. If you've got a really heavy hand and you made all your lines way too dark, you can come back in with your kneaded eraser and just use it like silly putty to lighten any lines that have gotten too dark. The blotting method is a lot more effective than the rubbing method. You're less likely to smear your drawing, but you do want to try to make it as crisp and clean in the end as you can.